In this lecture, we are going to talk about a number of the different principles and standards, not only that you should know for the exam, but with which you should also be familiar as a privacy professional. There is a lot of redundancy throughout all of these, and I think with regards to the exam, the only principles that you're likely to need to memorize are those that we already covered concerning the OECD guidelines and the APEC privacy framework. We will reference both of those again very briefly in this lecture. And the others that you probably need to know, and there are only 4 categories, are for the fair information practices, which we're going to look at in just a second. Otherwise, you should probably know that each of these is a different organization of principles and standards. And to help you remember these, I've provided a mnemonic device, and that's what we're going to start with. After we go over the mnemonic device, we're going to go over each of these, the Fair Information Practices, or the FIPS. The OECD guidelines we'll just touch on very briefly. We're going to look at the Generally Accepted Privacy Principles, or GAP, the CSA Privacy Code, briefly review the APEC Privacy Framework, and we will conclude with the European Telecommunications Standards Institute and the NIST Privacy Framework we will briefly mention, and the following lecture is devoted entirely to the NIST Privacy Framework. So our mnemonic device for remembering these different principles and standards is: fluffy owls gather cookies and eat noisily. Again, the first letter of each of these words corresponds to each of the different principles and standards we will look at in this lecture. Again, fluffy owls gather cookies and eat noisily. This corresponds to FIPS, OECD guidelines, GAP, CSA, APEC Privacy Framework, ETSI, and noisily corresponds to the NIST Privacy Framework. The Fair Information Principles are also known elsewhere as the Fair Information Practice Principles or Privacy Principles. So depending on what you're reading, you may see the title here slightly different, but colloquially, all of those different phrasings refer to the FIPS. Like the OECD and APEC principles, these are principles that are central to many frameworks, and the definitions vary. For the CIPM exam, however, you are going to be learning the categorization that is identical to the CIPP US exam. And so if you've taken my CIPP US course, then you will have seen these before. The 4 groups are rights of individuals, controls on information, the information lifecycle, and management. In the rights of individuals are notice, choice, consent, and data subject rights. On controls on information are information security and quality. In the information lifecycle are collection, use, retention, disclosure, and destruction. And within management are management and administration, monitoring, and enforcement. At the very least, you should know these 4 categories. I really recommend, again, because the FIPS are so central to many different frameworks, you should also definitely review the individual principles within each of these categories. As a quick review, when we discussed the OECD guidelines before, I don't recall whether or not we defined what OECD is. Very quickly, again, OECD stands for Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It is an intergovernmental organization with 38 member countries. It was founded in 1961. And the objective is to stimulate economic progress and world trade. Again, we've already looked over the OECD guidelines, so we're just going to do a quick review here. The full title is Guidelines on the Protection of Privacy and Transborder Flows of Personal Data. Globally, it is the most widely accepted set of privacy principles. And these guidelines are the basis of the GDPR alongside Convention 108. GAP, or the Generally Accepted Privacy Principles, was developed by the AICPA Privacy Task Force. AICPA is an acronym for the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, And CICA is an acronym for the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. So the word linking these two acronyms is accountants, if that's useful. CSA is an acronym that stands for Canadian Standards Association, and the CSA Privacy Code is the basis for the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA. At least I think it's PIPEDA. I'm not quite sure how that acronym is pronounced. But if you know for sure, if you are an expert on Canadian privacy, leave me a comment or reach out on Discord and let me know so I stop embarrassing myself. Again, the APEC Privacy Framework we've already looked at. APEC is an acronym for Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and this is a framework for Asia Pacific data transfers. ETSI, ETSI, is an acronym for the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. It is an independent, not-for-profit standardization organization, and it provides standards for information and communications technologies. And finally, NIST, NIST, is an acronym for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. NIST is a sub-agency within the Department of Commerce. The privacy framework is a voluntary framework, and it is technology, sector, and law agnostic. The objective here, as we'll see in the next lecture, is that this framework can be applied to any organization. In this lecture, we have gone over the most consequential and influential set of principles and standards. The mnemonic device to help you remember these is fluffy owls gather cookies and eat noisily. And again, you'll notice for most of these, for example, for GAP, the CSA Privacy Code, and for ETSI, we did not go over the specific principles. It is unlikely that you're going to be tested on specific principles related to those. Instead, I think it's important that you can identify that these are different sets of principles and standards. For the OECD guidelines and for the APEC privacy framework, refer to the lecture in Domain 1, where we went over the 8 different principles. Remember those. I think the second group that you should devote time to is the FIPS. Remember those 4 categories. And if you have time, definitely remember the different principles within each of those 4 categories. And for the next lecture, we're going to focus on the NIST privacy framework.